You expect Alabama to be cotton fields, church steeples, and the slow, honest flow of rivers that have guided towns and townspeople for generations. You expect Civil War markers and antebellum mansions and the familiar, human stories layered on top of the land. But beneath that linen and lace expectation there are places that do not quite fit the tidy narratives we hand down in classrooms and travel brochures. Places where earthworks rise like punctuation marks in the countryside, where caves keep a century-by-century ledger of people who passed through, and where local legend rubs against careful science until both begin to glow with possibility. In other words, you think you know this place, but the deeper you look, the less certain anything becomes. That tension, that delicious friction between what we think we know and the unquietness of what we don't, is the engine of this story. I promise you, in the next hours, we will stand at the lip of ancient plazas and walk the flooded paths of forgotten settlements. We will listen to the hush inside a cave that sheltered people for thousands of years and read the faint signatures of trade and ritual etched into pottery and human bone. We will meet the good, solid facts, radiocarbon dates, mound heights, trade beads, and pollen samples. And we will meet the questions that refuse tidy answers. Why did a city of hundreds of people arrange its plazas the way it did? Who carved the motifs that look, unnervingly, like travelers from far-off coasts? Did giants make an occasional cameo in these oral histories, or are those memories of something else entirely? I will give you the facts that archaeologists will stake their reputations on, and I will also give you the myths people still tell beside their porches. Both matter. Both are part of how we account for the past. We'll move slowly and carefully, because archaeology is patience dressed as method, and we'll also allow ourselves the quieter human impulse that turns data into meaning. This is not a dry catalogue. This is a narrated walk, fog clinging to the fields, a dog's distant bark, drums echoing in memory. When I say, picture yourself, do it. Imagine the chill of dawn over an earthen mound. Imagine your boots sinking slightly into a field that has been walked by humans, messily and lovingly, for more than 1,000 years. That is the portal through which we will explore each mystery. And though I will offer competing hypotheses and hard science where it exists, I will close each scene with a space for wonder. Because the point is not to close the book on these places but to keep reading between their lines. To keep us honest, when I offer dates, cultural labels, and measurements, they are drawn from archaeological surveys, museum catalogs, and site management reports, documents written by people whose work is to measure, test, and question. When I bring up giants, cursed stones, or lost tribes, I am not asking you to abandon critical thinking. Instead, I want you to appreciate that myths are often the human mind's shorthand for deep experiences that science later tries to decode. These narratives, whether delivered by a museum plaque or a grandmother's good scolding, are both threads in the same tapestry. And that tapestry, woven across time, is what we will be following. We begin, then, not with a small thing but with a place that insists on being seen, a complex of earthen mounds that still rises above a river plain like an unfinished sentence. The mounds are orderly and vast, the palisades once stood where the wind now walks, and the artifacts, pottery rims, beads, carved stone, are the echoes of lives lived in a landscape that looked very different back then. These are the kinds of places where ordinary assumptions evaporate, where trade routes reach farther than expected, where social hierarchies are written in the pitch of a mound, and where disappearance is not always the neat act historians prefer. We'll see how communities rose and fell, how mistakes in the soil whisper secrets, and how modern science still scrubs its hands at the edges of older, more persistent mysteries. Picture this: a river bends and on a flat but elevated terrace above it, a ring of mounds sits like sentinels. Some mounds are flat-topped, others conical. One was clearly a platform for ritual structures, another the resting place for high-status burials. At its peak, this was not a village of a dozen people but a political and ceremonial center, the kind of place that organizes regional trade and ritual calendars. Imagine, too, the noise, the voices of hundreds, fires, children running between houses, craftsmen pounding stone, and visitors arriving by canoe from distant valleys. Then imagine, centuries later, the silence that fell over those plazas. The reasons for that silence are among the oldest and most stubborn mysteries we will confront. Now, let's step closer and begin with that ring of earth and mortar, a site whose mounds are not only monuments but also questions in the landscape. Long before the grid of modern roads and the soft hum of traffic, a community of people arranged their world here with intent. They built platform mounds for public buildings and plazas for gatherings, and they organized their lives around the rhythms of rivers and the compass points of the heavens. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis show a clear arc, settlement, fluorescence, and decline, patterns we have seen before in other mound builder complexes across the southeast. But the precise timing, the scale of social organization, and the cultural affinities, who did what, when, and why, are where facts meet interpretation, and where new mysteries bloom. At the center of this arc is a population that archaeologists label as part of a broader Mississippian cultural horizon, a landscape of maize agriculture, social stratification, and elaborate mortuary practice that spread across much of the Mississippi Valley and its tributaries between roughly the first millennium and the time Europeans first pressed into the region. At its height, this particular settlement's plaza and mounds covered an area measured in hundreds of acres, and the mounds themselves rose tens of feet above the floodplain, visible from a long way off. These mounds were not random heaps. They were engineered, trucked fill and compacted layers that required organized labor and leadership to sustain. That alone tells us something crucial. There was political authority here and a shared set of meanings that justified the expenditure of collective effort. Archaeologists have found pottery sherds in a range of styles, shell beads that indicate long-distance exchange, copper fragments that suggest elite ornamentation, and isotopic traces that hint at diets rich in domesticated plants like maize but still balanced with hunted protein. The presence of exotic materials, marine shell from distant coasts or copper from far-off sources, tells a story of trade networks that crisscross the southeast. It also raises a question: how tightly connected were these networks? Were they structured like highways, with regular, institutional exchanges, or more like episodic trade fairs where goods moved as gifts between kin-based elites? The shape of those networks changes how we imagine daily life here, either as a locally centered polity with occasional visitors, or as a node plugged into a wider, dynamic system of exchange and influence. But here's where it gets tricky: the social archaeology, burial patterns, the arrangement of houses in the settlement, the kinds of objects placed with the dead, sometimes pulls in different directions. Some burials suggest pronounced inequality: high-status individuals interred with ornaments and exotic goods, others with plain graves. Yet, the distribution of domestic debris across the site shows that many households shared similar material footprints. So, was this a sharply hierarchical society with a small, wealthy elite and a mass of commoners, or a more vertically fluid community where status was situational and achieved rather than strictly inherited? Different scholars read the same evidence and come away with different pictures. The truth may lie somewhere between, but the ambiguity is precisely where the mystery breathes. Several compelling hypotheses have been proposed to explain the rise and later decline of the plaza and mound settlement. One set of explanations looks at environmental stress: shifts in river courses, flooding, drought cycles, and soil depletion could all make sustaining a dense population difficult. Pollen cores and geomorphological studies can, in some cases, show when maize cultivation intensified and when soils may have been overused. Another set of hypotheses centers on social upheaval, internal conflicts, rivalries between elite lineages, or disease outbreaks could fracture the social cohesion necessary for mound upkeep. There are also regional dynamics to consider: competition between nearby centers, or shifts in trade patterns that left this particular node isolated. Each hypothesis has evidence in its favor, and each leaves unresolved questions. The environmental data may show degradation, but not on a timeline that matches the sharpness of the societal shift. Social competition models explain sudden upheavals but have trouble accounting for long, gradual declines visible in other sections of the record. Now, let's be fair: oral histories and early historic accounts complicate the picture in valuable ways. Where archaeological strata are silent, later indigenous stories and European traveler journals sometimes mention abandoned towns, mounds with graves, or places said to be cursed. These later accounts are layered and often anachronistic. They cannot be treated as straightforward evidence for what happened a millennium earlier. Still, they show that the memory of these places remained alive in local consciousness for generations, enough to feed folklore and ritual practice later on. That lingering human attention complicates the notion of an absolute abandonment. In some cases, a site thought to be deserted was visited seasonally or retained as a sacred place long after permanent occupation declined. And then there are the stories that make archaeologists roll their eyes but that the public loves: legends of giants and of people with strange customs, tales of mounds that hum at night, or of bones that rearrange themselves. Folklore leagues myth and memory in ways that make proof impossible but meaning unavoidable. Mythic elements, giants, lost tribes, cursed stones, are not evidence in a scientific sense, but they are evidence of human experience. They tell us how later communities tried to absorb the presence of such imposing earthworks into their own cosmologies. Sometimes, what sounds like an absurd story in a modern ear is a compressed memory of a real event, a catastrophic flood, a violent battle, a plague, that has been translated across centuries into metaphor and myth. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn toward one of these mounds. The air is cold and damp, your breath makes small clouds, and the grasses are stiff with hoar. You climb the gently sloping side, feel the subtle changes in the soil under your soles, and stand on the flat top that once supported a house of bark and wood. Below, the river glitters like a ribbon; beyond it, the land folds into the horizon. Imagine, for a moment, the conversations that could have taken place on that platform, the delivery of a message, the performance of ceremony, the simple act of sitting and watching visitors arrive by canoe. Then imagine, with equal clarity, that same platform abandoned for reasons we cannot wholly, finally explain. Still, for all the evidence we can marshal, the pottery, the dates, the sizes of mounds, there remains a core of mystery. Why did the social order that produced such remarkable public architecture dissolve on that particular timeline? Was it ecological exhaustion, interrupted trade, internal conflict, or an act of history that escaped the archaeological record? Each possibility invites a different understanding of human capacity and fragility. The mound is a monument to organized labor and shared meaning. Its empty top is an invitation to ask how such energy can simply evaporate. We still don't know. We still don't know. At Bottle Creek, the water and the mounds conspire to make you question scale and intention in the same breath. An island of soil and ceremony rising like a deliberate thought in the maze of the mobile Tensas Delta. 18 earthen mounds ringed around plazas and canals that once organized a world of canoes, courtyards, and politics. Picture that single line as a one-sentence teaser. Bottle Creek is the delta-bound capital of the Pensacola people, where an entire society arranged itself on a swampy island between rivers and, for reasons we only partly understand, packed up and left a few centuries before Europeans fully occupied the Gulf Coast. The site's principal occupation falls between roughly AD 1250 and 1550, which places Bottle Creek squarely in the late Mississippian moment when maize agriculture, platform mounds, and regional chiefdoms shaped the rhythms of life across the southeastern woodlands. The mounds themselves reach impressive heights, measured by some surveys at about 45 feet to over 50 feet for the largest pyramid-like platforms, making them visible beacons in a landscape that floods and alters its face with the seasons, yet refuses to erase the evidence of deliberate construction. From an engineering standpoint, these were not casual heaps. These are compacted fill, reworked layers, and terraces that required planning, labor, and a shared cosmology that justified moving tons of earth to make grand public architecture. Archaeologists have long argued that the scale and arrangement of Bottle Creek indicate it operated as a political and ceremonial center, what we might call a chiefdom capital, controlling or at least coordinating trade, ritual, and seasonal gatherings across a watery frontier. Yet if the material facts give one impression of social centrality, the subtler lines of evidence complicate that picture. Pottery styles recovered from the site show both local traditions and connections to broader Gulf and interior ceramic repertoires. Shell and other marine artifacts point to exchange with coastal groups, and the distribution of domestic debris suggests many households lived in close proximity to public architecture, not merely under an elite shadow. So how tightly centralized was Bottle Creek's power? Was it a domineering court that commanded labor and tribute, or a ceremonial hub that drew disparate kin groups together for periodic pageants, alliances, and trade fairs? Different readings of the same sherds and hearths yield different social maps, and that interpretive tension is part of what makes the site hum with unresolved meaning. But here's where it gets tricky. The island's very location, deep in a tangled delta of channels and backwaters, means that for people who relied on dugout canoes and seasonally shifting waterways, Bottle Creek was both defensible and accessible. Its placement suggests strategic thought, a ceremonial capital that could control traffic on the rivers, that could appear remote to hostile outsiders but remain central to those who navigated the waterways as highways. Some scholars propose that such geography made Bottle Creek the perfect stage for chiefs who mediated trade and ritual across tribes and ecological zones. Others argue that the site's location and heavy dependence on riverine access would have made it vulnerable to climate oscillation, changes in rainfall, storm frequency, or channel morphology could alter access and the agricultural base needed to support a dense population. Radiocarbon dates bracket the high occupation in the centuries immediately before and during early European presence on the Gulf, and that proximity to a changing world invites further speculations. Did Bottle Creek's decline relate to shifts in long-distance exchange networks, to epidemics introduced through intermittent contact, or to environmental pressures that made sustaining a large, concentrated population difficult? The evidence allows each possibility but supplies no neat causality. Pollen cores, for instance, can tell us when maize intensified on the floodplain and when soils may have suffered, but they do not always line up cleanly with the archaeological layer where occupation thins. Now, let's be fair, oral histories and early colonial accounts are thin, fragmentary, and often filtered through the misunderstandings of later centuries, yet they insist that these mounds carried meaning long after permanent habitation declined. Even when seasonal use replaced permanent residence, Bottle Creek retained ritual importance for neighboring peoples, which suggests abandonment was rarely a single, dramatic event but more often a rearrangement of relationships with place. Important discoveries at Bottle Creek have given us further anchors: mapped mound groups arranged around plazas, evidence of causeways and canals, and artifacts that include shell ornaments and goods that came from beyond the immediate delta, material threads of a trade network stitched through both inland and coastal spheres. Excavations beginning in the early 20th century and continuing in fits and starts have revealed house patterns, hearths, and refuse pits that show daily life alongside the grand architecture, and those human traces are what make Bottle Creek palpable rather than merely monumental. But for all the data we have, layered soils, pottery chronologies, map structure, competing theories stubbornly persist. One account stresses environmental determinism. If the river courses changed, if hurricanes and storm surges reshaped the delta, or if successive seasons of heavy flooding made corn agriculture unreliable, the food base needed to keep a ceremonial capital afloat would falter. Another read places social transformation at the center: local political strife, emergent rival centers, or shifts in how elites redistributed goods could undercut the labor mobilization that built and maintained platform mounds. A third, darker theory suggests that intermittent contact with Europeans or other groups introduced pathogens or market goods that destabilized existing trade and social networks, while direct European documentation about Bottle Creek is slim, because it had been largely abandoned by early French explorers. This proximity opens the possibility that indirect impacts rippled through the delta even before consistent colonial presence. Each theory leans on different kinds of evidence, and each asks us to imagine the past in different tones: a slow ecological sigh, a political coup, or an invisible epidemic passing silently between people in the delta's night. And then there are the stories that do not appear in lab reports, the local myths of lost gods and strange ceremonies, the tall tales of mounds that whisper in the wind, and the family narratives about ancestors who refused to leave or who vanished in a single season. Mythic language here is not neutral, it is interpretive shorthand. Sometimes, legends of giants who once ruled the delta or of sacred stones that hummed at night are ways for later communities to account for the imposing physicality of the mounds, large constructions that do not arise from a single family's effort but from generations. Those legends might be compressed memories of ritual leaders whose reputation grew into myth, or they might be poetic ways to talk about trauma, floods that wiped away fields, conflicts that rearranged kin networks, or disease that thinned crowds and left plazas hollow. Picture yourself pushing through a stand of cypress, the air thick with humidity and the smell of river mud, and then arriving at the open sweep of a central plaza ringed by low terraces where houses once stood. Imagine the scrape of canoe hulls on a distant bank, the smell of smoke from many hearths, the cry of a child, the sound of a drum in a public house on a mound top. Imagine the sudden hush, decades later, when fires go out and the plazas take on grass. The mounds remain, but the social choreography that produced them has broken down into new patterns, some seasonal return, some ritual revision. That sensory shift is an archaeological problem as much as a human one. A place designed for many people becomes a place for memory, and memory slowly morphs into myth. Still, for all the evidence, radiocarbon dates, mapped mound architecture, artifact assemblages, the core question lingers with a stubborn intimacy. How did a society capable of moving mountains of earth, organizing a landscape, and sustaining broad trade networks dissolve into partial abandonment and ritual memory? Was Bottle Creek's story the slow unthreading of environmental strain, the more abrupt reconfiguration of political alliances, the invisible hand of disease, or some combination of these? The answer matters because it reframes how we think about human resilience and vulnerability. A complex chiefdom can be both ingeniously adaptive and frighteningly fragile. We still don't know exactly which mix of causes ended Bottle Creek's centuries of prominence, and that uncertainty keeps the island alive in our imagination as much as in our maps. You push past a stand of wildflowers and honeysuckle and find the cave's mouth like a dark, patient eye. Russell Cave, a place that keeps time in layers of ash and bone and flint. One-sentence teaser. Russell Cave is a single place where 12,000 years of human occupation are stored in the cave floor like rings in a tree, and the sheer continuity of that record asks questions we're still fumbling to answer. The charcoal from its earliest fires has been radiocarbon dated to roughly 6550 to 6145 BC, and large-scale excavations in the mid-20th century recovered tons of artifacts, stone points, bone tools, pottery sherds, along with the remains of people who used the shelter across millennia. Imagine how that feels, a single cool throat of rock providing winter shelter for people who lived in a world without maize, then later hosting families who were beginning to tend more predictable gardens and make pottery. Here is a place where the archaic peoples left deer bones and passenger pigeon remains and where, later, woodland and Mississippian-era signatures appear in the strata. The cave's deposits are a long human ledger. That continuity is both treasure and provocation. How did lifeways change gradually here, and how much of what we see is seasonal use rather than permanent settlement? The cave seems to say, we use this place in many different ways over many different climates, and the answers are in those stratified layers if we learn how to read them. Archaeologists who excavated Russell Cave in the 1950s and 1960s, in collaboration with the Smithsonian and the National Geographic Society, left us an extraordinary dataset: hearths, chipstone tools, faunal remains, and human burials that together sketch shifts in technology, diet, and social practice across thousands of years. But here's where it gets tricky. The pattern of artifacts suggests seasonality. People coming to the cave in the colder months to ride out winter, and then dispersing to other territories in spring and summer. Yet, other traces imply longer, repeated occupation with sophisticated use of space inside the cave. Some burials are simple and shallow, others are absent of grave goods, which complicates inferences about social differentiation. Was the cave primarily a winter refuge for groups whose social life was otherwise dispersed? Or did it serve, at times, as a more permanent anchor for a population adapting to changing environments? Different specialists read the same charcoal and bone differently. Some emphasize mobility and foraging, others point to increasing sedentism and resource management in the later layers. The point is not to pick winners but to show how the cave forces us to hold multiple images of the past at once. Now let's be human about it. Imagine walking in the frost into Russell Cave at dawn, the air inside a velvet shadow, the smell of last night's fire still clinging to the stone. You step carefully over the ancient midden, and your boot squeaks on the desiccated bone. Think of the conversations that might have taken place here, how they planned winter hunts, mended tools, told stories to pass long nights, and also how those stories shift when long centuries accumulate. Folktales collected in the region sometimes fold Russell Cave into larger narratives of human endurance, of a place that has seen giants and shamans and drought-driven migrations. These stories are not scientific data, but they are evidence of how later people related to this dark place. They are part of its human aura. They also remind us that what archaeologists call occupation can look very different through the eyes of the descendants for whom the cave remained a meaningful place. Still, for all the hearths and microliths and radiocarbon years, we confront a stubborn question: how precisely did long-term patterns of mobility, subsistence, and social networks transform across Russell Cave's record? Was the story smooth and incremental, or did punctuated events, climatic shift, conflict, resource stress, leave their mark? We still don't know. Then there is Moundville, which confronts you with a different scale of human intention. 29 massive, flat-topped earthen mounds arranged around a vast plaza on a black Warrior River bluff, some rising as high as 50-odd feet and others low but ceremonially placed, all articulating a social order in earth and geometry. One-sentence teaser: Moundville is a Mississippian capital where architecture and art combine to suggest an intensely ranked society, and the sheer ambition of the place forces us to ask how such power was marshaled and why it collapsed. Archaeological investigations date Moundville's main occupation roughly between AD 1000 and AD 1450, with the site growing dramatically after AD 1150 into a major regional center that, at its height, may have organized a population of perhaps a few thousand within the plaza and tens of thousands across its broader valley. The mounds were not anonymous heaps. They were stage sets for public houses, mortuary sites, and elite residences, and the distribution of mound sizes is often read as an architectural expression of rank: the largest mounds for the highest clans, smaller mounds for lesser but still important precincts. Those measurements and dates anchor interpretations that see Moundville as a political economy built around maize agriculture, craft specialization, and long-distance exchange in copper, mica, shell, and other prestige goods. But here's where we wobble. If Moundville appears to be the clearest local manifestation of Mississippian chiefdom politics in the Southeast, the archaeological evidence still resists a single, clean story about how inequality, religion, and political power interacted there. Artistic finds, fashioned ceramics, engraved shell cups, embossed copper plates, speak to a visual language of rank and cosmology, yet the everyday debris spread around the mounds suggests that many households shared similar domestic footprints. Was Moundville governed by a relatively stable aristocracy that monopolized ritual and redistributed surplus, or was its social life more complex, with shifting alliances, seasonal gatherings, and negotiated leadership that temporarily centralized at the plaza? Scholars point to palisade remains and shifts in settlement patterns as indicators of threat and conflict. Pottery chronologies and burial assemblages suggest waves of reorganization, yet none of these indicators provide a full cause-and-effect chain of growth and decline. The decline that begins around AD 1300 and accelerates into abandonment by roughly AD 1450 is visible, but why the decline happened at that tempo, ecological overreach, political fragmentation, disease, or regional realignment of trade, remains contested. The archaeological record gives us the what and the when in broad strokes but leaves the why deliciously, maddeningly open. Picture yourself standing in Moundville's great plaza at dusk, the last sun slanting off the river, the silhouettes of mounds arrayed like a deliberate congregation. Imagine drums rising from platform houses, processions threading between mounds, leaders garbed in copper and shell, a choreography of power made of bodies and earth. Then imagine the same plaza centuries later, quiet and grass-covered, the wooden houses long gone, the social performance dispersed. That sensory contrast is the archaeological problem writ large. What social mechanisms created such concentrated public architecture, and what combination of pressure unstitched that arrangement until the site's ceremonial heart beat more faintly or stopped altogether? There are hypotheses, intensifying maize monoculture that stressed soils and necessitated mobility, conflict indicated by palisades and trauma in skeletal remains, or the shifting of trade routes that undercut the elite's capacity to redistribute exotic goods. Each theory points to different human stories, of resilience, of failure, of adaptation, and each is partial. We still don't know. On the Gulf Coast and in the Sound there are other kinds of puzzles, shell mounds and rings that look like messy refuse heaps but, on closer inspection, are more than midden. They are palimpsests where diet, ritual, and landscape interaction are written in compacted oyster and clam. One-sentence teaser: the shell middens that dot the coast, Grand Bay and the littoral sites along the Mississippi Sound and Alabama shore, are monumental accumulations of food and meaning that force us to rethink seasonal mobility, sedentism, and the human impact on coastal ecosystems. Archaeological research into archaic and later shell mounds shows that these features were formed over centuries, sometimes intentionally shaped into terraces or rings that might have had ceremonial or residential purposes as much as they functioned as disposal sites. Recent research across the Southeast has shifted the conversation. These mounds are not random piles but often reflect long-term investments in place that can indicate semi-sedentary communities who manage estuarine resources intensively. Sea level fluctuations, storm histories, and changing estuarine productivity complicate the story. Where oysters were plentiful, dense settlement was possible, but those very resources are sensitive to climate and human harvesting pressure. As a result, coastal shell sites provide an ecological and social record that intersects deeply with questions of climate variability, human resource management, and early forms of social complexity. Now, let's be fair, the coastal myths are as rich as the middens themselves. Local fishermen and families tell of shell mounds that hum when the tide is right, of cursed middens where fishermen's nets snag on unseen bones, and of ancestors who refused to leave shoreline camps even when storms came. These stories, again, are not archaeological proof, but they are cultural data, how communities remember and ritualize the places where their predecessors lifted oysters and speared mullet. Competing scientific explanations for formation and abandonment of coastal sites include climatically driven changes in productivity, storm-driven destruction, overharvesting, or shifts in social organization that reoriented people toward inland maize agriculture and mound building. Each scenario is plausible in particular settings. No single explanation fits all shell sites. Picture yourself walking a spit at low tide where the exposed shell bed is powdered and white. The sun is flat and sharp, and ghostly piles of shell rise like miniature cliffs. Imagine the hands that gathered and cracked those shells, the conversation at the end of a long day, the ceremonial uses of shell both as ornament and as currency. Then imagine a great storm washing some of those terraces away and a subtle demographic rearrangement that moves people a few miles inland over generations. That slow displacement is as much a human drama as a geological process. Still, for all the carbon dates and ceramic typologies and geomorphological cores, we return to a central question. How do we reconcile the apparent long-term investment that created these mounds with the suddenness of the disasters that sometimes appear to have ended intensive use? We still don't know. We could talk, and we will, about other places, rock art panels whose glyphs tease us, isolated stone alignments that do not fit the wider Southeast's earthen architecture, small ceremonial sites whose pottery suggests connections to distant coasts or river valleys. And we must, because each of these places complicates the tidy lines historians and archaeologists like to draw. In every case, the pattern is similar. Careful excavation yields dates and artifacts and environmental proxies. Those data generate plausible narratives of trade, ritual, subsistence, and social organization. But at the moment when we press for causality, why did societies reorganize, move, or vanish? The evidence fans into multiple plausible interpretations. Each theory, environmental change, conflict, disease, economic reorientation, has support in some combination of dates, faunal remains, settlement patterns, and paleoclimatic data. None provides a universal key. The human past, as revealed in Alabama's ancient places, is a braided story where ecology, politics, belief, and accident thread together and sometimes fray. We still don't know. You push off from the delta and follow a low river until the land tightens into limestone bluffs, and there, rubbed into the face of stone and hidden in shadowed caves, are images that have kept people arguing for generations: painted figures, swirling circles, serpents, and human-like shapes whose meaning is no less elusive now than when they were first made. One sentence tease: Painted Bluff and the cave art pockets of northern Alabama are places where images stare back at us from a very old human gaze, and their scale and persistence force us to ask who made them, why, and how those meanings echoed between families and generations. The open-air panel known as Painted Bluff overlooks the Tennessee River and preserves more than 100 pictographs and a handful of petroglyphs, arranged on ledges and cliffs in a humid environment where so much else of a rock art tradition has been erased, making it one of the most significant rock art occurrences in the Southeast. The art belongs to a conversation that runs across archaic, woodland, and Mississippian lifeways. Some motifs are simple circles and lines, others are unmistakable anthropomorphs and animals, and some panels look, at first glance, like maps or calendars. That variety tells us right away that these images were not a single act but an accumulation of practice across centuries, perhaps millennia, where different hands and different contexts layered meaning on the same stone face. The sheer number of motifs and their stratified placement on the bluff led archaeologists to treat Painted Bluff as a rare, open-air repository of visual thought in a region where humidity usually erases such things. Close inspection of these panels, done by university teams and federal partners, has revealed motifs that map onto known Mississippian cosmologies: circles and concentric rings that might denote stars or suns, serpentine lines that echo river cosmologies, and anthropomorphic figures that were what could be regalia or simply the marks of a distinct artistic idiom. But here's where it gets tricky: rock art resists tidy dating. A painted motif may be touched up in multiple eras, pigments can be reapplied or smeared, and organic binders rarely survive long enough for direct radiocarbon dating. So, while the panels clearly belong to a long visual tradition, pinning down a precise chronology for individual images is difficult. Stylistic comparison, contextual archaeology nearby, and careful conservation work give hints, but the results remain provisional. The conservationists who cleaned graffiti and stabilized the panels in the 2000s could only add to the archive of images, not to the precision of their dates, and that lack of resolution keeps Painted Bluff in a fascinating interpretive tension. It is both remarkably preserved and annoyingly mute when we press for specifics. Now, let's be fair, images are invitations rather than proofs. A crescent shape could be a moon, a canoe, or a stylized jawbone. An anthropomorph might be a dancer, a shaman, or a composite being that mixes human and spirit. Archaeologists propose multiple readings: astronomical markers, territorial signs, ritual mnemonics, or even simple images for storytelling, and each reading changes how we imagine the people who painted them. If the panels encoded seasonal cycles, the painters were teachers and astronomers. If they recorded myth, they were story keepers and ritual specialists. If they marked territorial passages, they were political actors asserting claims in a contested landscape. The truth might be all of these at once. Ancient images often do several jobs simultaneously because human life seldom obeys neatly divided categories. Picture yourself rowing up the Tennessee at sunset, the water dark and slow, the bluff appearing as a sudden wall where bird calls and the smell of wet stone meet pigment-made shapes. You step ashore and stand before a circle that has weathered 1,000 storms, and in that silent confrontation you feel the multi-temporal conversation between present and past. That bodily feeling, of standing under rock and in a lineage of viewers, is part of what rock art demands of us. Beneath the dramatic panels lies another, quieter set of mysteries found deeper in the subterranean dark. Large, recently documented cave paintings and etchings inside the limestone systems of the Southeast have surprised researchers by their scale and detail. Teams using 3D scanning and careful low-impact recording have revealed panels and motifs in cave chambers whose humidity preserved the pigment in ways impossible on open ledges. These subterranean images, some quite large, force us to reconsider assumptions about where people created art and why. The fact that cave chambers, often reachable only with difficulty, hold such images implies purposeful pilgrimage into darkness, ritual behavior that harnessed both the sensory features of the cave and the symbolic potency of interior passages. Was cave darkness associated with particular cosmological realms, origins, the underworld, or ancestor places? Were some caves reserved for specialist painters or ritual experts? The physical effort to reach those depths suggests ceremony rather than casual doodling. Yet, as always, the archaeological traces permit multiple interpretations, and different caves show different patterns of use. What is clear is this: the cavernous spaces preserve a visual archive that sometimes exceeds our expectations for prehistoric Southeast art. Now, no narrative about images in rock and cave is complete without addressing the mythic, those stories that families and local histories tell about giants, shamans, and long-vanished people whose stature is magnified by distance and time. Alabama, like many regions with imposing prehistoric earthworks and rock panels, has accumulated a robust folklore, tales of ancient giants whose bones were once turned up in plowed fields, of stone faces that cry when the river rises, and of spirits that guard certain ledges at dusk. These stories are not archaeological claims, they are cultural memory. They sometimes rest on misreadings of large animal bones, on 19th-century newspaper sensationalism, or on modern internet amplifications. The recurring giants myth, stories that men of enormous stature were buried under mounds, has been extensively examined and debunked by historians and fact-checkers. Many 19th and early 20th century accounts were hoaxes, misidentified megafauna, or exaggerations amplified by sensational press. Institutions like the Smithsonian never admitted to destroying thousands of giant skeletons. Modern fact-checking by Reuters, AP, Snopes, and PolitiFact has shown that those dramatic claims are unsupported and stem from satirical or unreliable sources. That doesn't mean the stories are worthless. On the contrary, myth reveals how communities interpret monumental places and how wonder can metamorphose into legend. But it does mean we must separate folkloric meaning from empirical claims about human biology. Picture yourself, then, at night standing beneath the painted Bluff ledge with a small lantern. Imagine the pigment catching your light, the shapes both intimate and alien. Around you, someone tells the tale of a giant whose footsteps left depressions in the hillside. The tale feels true in the way a story can feel true. It carries moral warning, place-based identity, and a poetic sense of deep time. But when we walk with archaeologists into the field the next day and measure bone fragments or analyze pigments, the story's literal claims fall away, leaving behind the more interesting question: why do we tell this story at this site? Sometimes folklore is a corrective. It keeps a place protected because people fear its ghosts. Sometimes folklore is a claim of belonging, an assertion that our ancestors made this, expressed in larger-than-life terms. The coexistence of rigorous scientific study and robust myth is not a battle to be settled, it is a conversation to be honored. Away from cliffs and caves, along the confluence of the Cahawba and Alabama rivers, there's a different human drama written in brick, earth, and the ghostly geometry of a colonial town, Old Cahawba. One sentence tease: Old Cahawba is a ghost town built around an indigenous mound that became a tense frontier between native autonomy and settler ambitions, and its layered remnants force us to ask how colonialism reworked older sacred landscapes. Archaeological and historical work at Cahawba shows that the area was used by indigenous peoples long before Euro-Americans arrived, and the town of Cahawba, founded as Alabama's first state capital in 1819, was later superimposed on a landscape already structured by centuries of native habitation. Excavations and historic maps reveal a flat-topped mound dating to roughly the 16th century in the area, the product of indigenous community planning, and later the town's streets and buildings repeatedly adapted to the same ground. Old Cahawba's archaeology is rich because it sits at the crossroads of prehistoric and historic eras, binding indigenous mound-making to the drama of early American state building, floods, and eventual abandonment when the capital moved and the town declined into the ghost it is today. That layered history shows how new colonial systems often repurpose, obfuscate, and sometimes desecrate older sacred geographies, producing places dense with both material traces and unresolved human stories. Archaeologists working at Old Cahawba have used maps, building strata, and ground survey techniques to reveal how the town's grid sat atop older semicircular village plans and defensive palisades. Soil cores indicate the presence of a constructed mound of roughly a half-acre in area dating to the late pre-contact or early contact period, evidence of a community that invested substantial labor into public architecture shortly before major European incursions. The later European-American town left its own archaeology, brick foundations, refuse pits, and patterns of industry that allow researchers to read the palimpsest of human occupation in the same slice of earth. But here's where it gets tricky. Disentangling the indigenous sequence from the colonial occupation can be messy because later construction sometimes cut through earlier features, and repeated flooding and channel migration have reshaped the floodplain where Cahawba stands. The environmental history, floods, meander shifts, and soil deposition, complicates simple narratives of abandonment. Was the town left because of economic shifts, or because the river altered the town's viability? And prior to the town, why did indigenous peoples build a mound here? Was it ritual, defensive, symbolic of kinship? The archaeological record supplies clues but not always neat causation. We still don't know, in a full and final sense, how the threads of art, architecture, and colonization knot together in places like painted Bluff and Old Cahawba. We have spectacular images carved and painted into stone, cave panels that demand careful descent, a ghost town over an indigenous mound, and a wash of local legends that insist something larger than life once walked these places. Each line of evidence, pigments and motif categories, radiocarbon brackets, map mound dimensions, historic maps, nudges us towards stories that are plausible and meaningful. But when we press the question of motive, chronology, and human decision, the why that sits closest to human hearts, the evidence fans into multiple, sometimes incompatible interpretations. That is not a failing of archaeology. It is its promise. Places that keep their secrets teach us to hold many possible paths at once. So stand for a moment beneath the painted stone or on the grassy crest of Old Cahawba's mound and feel the patient, unresolved hum of history. We still don't know. There is a temptation at the end of any long excavation, whether of words or of soil, to tidy the mess, arrange the shards into a neat drawer, write a single declarative sentence, close the book. But if these places have taught us anything, it is that tidy endings are rarely the truth. Instead, what they teach us is a way to hold the messy, brilliant ambiguity of human life, the overlapping of toil and ritual, of survival and splendor, of ordinary breath and deliberate monument. We have walked mounds and canoes, peered into caves where charcoal remembers cold nights, stood beneath painted stone and listened to folklore condense into myth. Along the way we have matched dates to pottery rims, mapped plazas where people once gathered, and read pollen cores as if they were the slow breath of fields. Yet after all that, the most powerful place to end is not a list of facts but a reflection on what those facts mean for us now, how the earth, the stories, and the artifacts stitch into a single human habit, to make meaning in the face of uncertainty. Think of it this way, a mound is not just a pile of earth. It is a negotiated claim on time. To build one requires people who can persuade others to bend their backs and give their days to a project whose benefits may be temporal, spiritual, or political. Whether a mound crowns a plaza at Moundville, forms a ceremonial ring at Bow Creek, or anchors a seasonal camp near the coast, each shape is the residue of human intention scaled up across generations. When the mounds stand quietly in fields now, grass unrolling over former platforms, what remains is not only the physical architecture but a memory of what people believed could be achieved together. When plazas fall into silence, it is not merely abandonment, it is the end of a certain choreography of social life. That choreography can be undone by droughts, by storms, by disease, by shifting alliances, by new markets, by the slow exhaustion of a soil or a relationship. Any single explanation rarely fits all the facts because the human world is a braided system. And yet that braided system is the very thing that makes these sites meaningful. They show us that human communities are at once inventive and vulnerable. You and I, listening now, are part of the same long habit of witnessing. We are modern heirs of people who read the sky for planting, who read bone for food, who read images for meaning. The cognitive act that made a circular plaza is the same act that makes us sit in a quiet room and puzzle out the past. We are pattern-seeking animals who give stories to what we see. That capacity is our strength and our caution. It allows us to reconstruct probable sequences and to imagine the lives that made them, but it also tempts us to fill the gaps with grand narratives of unstoppable collapse or of benevolent progress that the evidence will not support. The balanced stance is a kind of humility, a willingness to hold multiple hypotheses, to weigh them, and to accept that some answers will remain stubbornly out of reach. In holding that humility, we honor both the people who lived here and the craft of scholarship that attempts to recover them. There is also a moral dimension to this archaeology that cannot be tidy. These are not neutral objects in a lab. They are places that have meaning for living people whose lineages connect to the past in ways that go beyond the stratigraphic column. Descendant communities bring their own interpretations, their own sacred claims, and their own healing questions. When we study mounds or cave paintings, we must therefore be attentive to the living stories and the legal and ethical arrangements that protect burial sites and cultural heritage. Scientific curiosity does not take place in a vacuum. It must be tempered by respect and partnership. In many of these Alabama places, collaboration with descendant communities has changed the questions archaeologists ask and the ways they ask them. That co-production of knowledge is one of the most hopeful developments in our shared engagement with the past. It reorients archaeology from an extractive practice to a collaborative one that sees these sites not as puzzles to conquer but as shared human legacies to steward. If there is a single emotional payoff to this long journey through mounds, caves, and coastal middens, it is that the past throws back to us the same concerns we feel now. The builders of plazas negotiated food security and trade. They negotiated who spoke in public and who had access to ritual space. They coped with floods, with droughts, with shifting alliances, and with the appearance of new peoples and goods on their horizons. In short, they faced the same core human tasks we do: how to feed a family, how to organize for common goals, how to remember the dead and make sense of the cosmic order. Their material solutions, mounds, plazas, painted stones, were particular and local, but their questions were universal. That is why their faint voices in the soil still matter. They show that the big challenges of human life, group organization, ecological adaptation, cultural meaning, are neither new nor solved. They are our inheritance. And there is, too, a deeper kind of consolation. Standing on a mound at dawn, you feel small and continuous at once. Small because your personal life is brief compared to the slow arc of earth and settlement. Continuous because your breath, your attention, the stories you carry, are part of a human thread that has survived droughts, wars, and migrations. The archaeological record is full of ruptures, moments when something breaks and the social choreography changes. But it is also full of continuities, certain forms of pottery that persist, certain symbols whose contours reappear, certain practices of burial or ceremony that connect centuries. These continuities show that while human plans are fragile, human sensibilities are stubborn. We carry on even after calamity, reshaping our environment and our institutions, making new mounds, new myths, new songs. That resilience is not romantic, it is messy, costly, and sometimes cruel, but it is real. The people who lived in and around Alabama's ancient sites did not vanish into oblivion. Their descendants remember, and their material traces remain to be read, argued about, and honored. So what, finally, should you do with this knowledge? You could treat these sites as mere curiosities, or you could let them shift your sense of time and responsibility. Knowing the past is not merely an academic exercise. It can change how we think about the present. If mound builders wrestled with ecological variability, so do we, though on different scales and with different technologies. If coastal communities face storm surges and shifting estuaries, their responses can inform our own conversations about sea level rise and resilient design, though we must never make simplistic equivalencies between ancient peoples' lifeways and modern policy choices. The real lesson is one of humility and care. To approach places with respect, to protect them, and to use what they teach us about long-term thinking and communal action. Imagine again, for a final moment, walking the foggy trail at dawn to a mound whose top has been flattened by centuries of feet. Imagine the smell of damp grass, the hush that only a field can offer before a town wakes, the sway of a single bird as you stand and think. Now imagine you are not the first person to stand there in the morning light. That continuity of presence, the long human gaze toward place, is a comfort and a responsibility. It asks you to listen for the faintest echoes in the soil and to let those echoes bend your modern assumptions. It asks you to hold several theories, to prefer evidence over spectacle, but to also leave room for wonder. And it asks you to act, to protect these places legally and morally, to support the co-creative work of descendant communities and scholars, and to carry forward the stories with humility and accuracy. There are still mysteries, broad, persistent, and beautiful ones. Why did certain centers grow huge and vanish? How exactly did everyday life transform across millennia at Russell Cave? What precisely did those painted bluffs mean to their first viewers? And how did that meaning shift when new groups saw the same images centuries later? Which of the local tales of giants and hums have roots in misidentification and which in metaphor? Each question is an invitation, not a deficit. To be invited is different than being told. It means your curiosity has a job, to investigate, to weigh, to listen. And when you do investigate, whether by following an archaeologist's field report, reading a descendant community's oral history, or simply visiting a preserved mound and standing quietly, you participate in a long conversation that has no final summation. The past is not closed, it is a series of openings. So as we close this chapter of looking, let it be an opening. Treat these mounds and caves and shell rings as living teachers that ask us not for answers only but for stewardship. Let them remind you that human life is about collective acts, of building, of remembering, of confronting the unknown together. Let them remind you that the past is full of people who were clever and fallible in equal measure, and that their best work, mounds, plazas, painted rock, remains to teach us patience, ingenuity, and humility. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.